you ever wondered what Barrington looked like before Route 14 spawned a gauntlet of car dealers, fast food joints, and mini shopping centers? Before the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad connected Barrington to downtown Chicago? Before John Plaguey opened his store on South Cook Street? Before Gilbert Appleby built a house on Main Street? What landscape awaited the first settlers? Generically, the landscape was prairie. As its nickname implies, the prairie state was dominated by sweeping grasslands. They had been named by early French explorers who used a word that meant meadow. Specifically, the Barrington area was a patchwork of botanic communities, ranging from wetlands, fens and bogs, to mesic and gravel hill prairies, to prairie woodlands or savannas. From early accounts, the spectacle was one of rare beauty. Dr. A.W. Hare wrote in 1850, "One of the most marvelous sights of my whole life, unsurpassed in my travels in nearly all parts of the world, was that of the Illinois prairie in the spring." The all-absorbing business of the first settlers, understandably, was to build homes, establish commerce, develop transportation networks, overturn the prairie sod to plant and harvest crops. These goals were pursued with such vigor and success that the landscape that characterized this area was thoroughly and even irretrievably transformed. Wetlands were drained and filled. Mesic prairies were overturned and built upon. Prairie savannas were timbered and grazed. A crucial component of the prairie landscape, fire, was stopped. The development was a normal dynamic in the history of human encounter with the land, but it took place and continues to take place with such single-minded disregard for the native prairie landscape that the plants and wildlife native to this area have largely disappeared. John Plaguey and Gilbert Appleby would have to do a lot of sleuthing before they could find a prairie dock or a Henslow's sparrow, species probably abundant beyond counting before Queen Anne's lace, buckthorn, and the English sparrow began their monopoly. Traces of native plant communities do exist in and around Barrington. They are readily apparent to anyone who has come to know the special plants that can claim the distinction of native. A major relic of pre-settlement landscape hangs on along the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad tracks that parallel Route 14. Thanks to the original charter of the railroad companies, which granted them right-of-way on either side of the tracks, original prairie vegetation, though badly degraded in many areas, grows along the railway, especially between Hart Road and Fox River Grove. In August, blazing stars rear magenta heads beneath the invading billboards. Indian grass and big bluestem, two giant grass species that are integral components of the tall grass prairie, toss their seed heads with the wind and the gusts from passing trains and car traffic on Route 14. It is largely from this railroad right-of-way, this corridor of living landscape history, that a prairie in Barrington will be recreated. The project, the restoration of a native Illinois prairie, was begun in 1986 by Citizens for Conservation, the local conservation organization. Well aware of the precious little original landscape surviving in the community, and alarmed at the accelerating disappearance of native species seed sources, members of CFC agreed to mount an ambitious, vigorous effort to reestablish a plant community that would be composed of the grasses and flowers that greeted the first settlers and that would welcome wildlife species that once called the prairie home. Tom Vanderpool, a landscape architect and restorer of a prairie on his back 2 acres north of town, agreed to plan and coordinate the project. He and other Prairie Committee members walked the various properties that belonged to CFC and decided that one was tailor-made for a prairie restoration. That one is a large tract at the corner of Oak Knoll and Buckley Roads in Barrington Hills, donated to CFC by Peggy Richards. It is a rolling property, well suited to a variety of prairie subcommunities. It offers promise of vista, a hint of endless grassland that was considered desirable in the selection of a site. Meadowlarks, bobolinks, and grasshopper sparrows, all birds of the open prairie, nest on the property. A few old bur oaks and hickories tell of earlier savanna, where prairie grasses and flowers bloomed beneath trees in an open woodland. The idea is to transform what was once rolling prairie and is now a meadow of alien plants back to its original character. The first stage involves 7 acres of the meadow. Steps in the project include seed collection, growing seedlings in flats, spring disking, summer sowing, weeding, and transplanting of seedlings, and follow-up watering and enrichment with seeds and seedlings. Collecting seeds is the most important and time-consuming job. Prairie plants set seed on an individual schedule between mid-June and early November. Volunteer harvesters need to be ready when the seeds are. In the first seed collecting effort of 1986, over 70 volunteers gathered 94 pounds of prairie seed, much of it along the Chicago and Northwestern tracks. The decision to gather seeds, mostly within a 15-mile radius of Barrington, hopefully ensures that the composition of the recreated prairie will accurately reflect the plant species originally found there. Pickers usually met at the Ace Hardware parking lot, then proceeded to the day's site, where they gathered for specific instructions. Most volunteers didn't know a prairie grass from a barnyard variety when they started. As they were shown special features of grasses and forbs, or flowers, their repertoire of identifiable prairie species grew and grew and grew. When you spend an hour or two gleaning seeds from turkeyfoot, it's a sure bet you'll not forget those 3-pronged bloom heads, and appreciate their special beauty as well. Small groups prowled unprotected prairie remnants and found porcupine grass in early summer. The seeds of this plant are twisted and actually drill themselves into the soil. In an open area belonging to the Paganica development, the seed of white wild indigo was gathered. The site also yielded significant amounts of seed from Seneca snakeroot and yellow pimpernel, both savanna indicators, and likely to have grown on the Richards site not far distant. Special attention was paid to locating sources for the seed from prairie forbs like prairie gentian, butterfly weed, purple prairie coneflower. A contingent made a pilgrimage to Harvard to gather seed from green gentians in September. Early autumn is the peak seed time for prairie species. The gathering schedule included at least 3 outings a week, and sometimes more. Several pounds of big bluestem was collected one afternoon near Cuba Road. Volunteers adrift in a copper sea of little bluestem gathered 4 pounds of the fluffy seed on a crisp autumn morning. That day, as on many of the outings, workers paused to gaze at a red-tailed hawk drifting on the currents overhead. Special events and wondrous creatures abound in wild prairie gardens. When winter brought an end to the first season of seed collecting, the harvest was painstakingly sorted to await sowing in mid-June. Some was planted in flats, where young seedlings will be nurtured for later planting in the prairie. Plans call for collecting next year and the next. The crucial factor is volunteers. With their commitment and help, the vision of an Illinois prairie in Barrington will take on the texture, color, sound, and vitality of an original landscape. Route 14 will probably continue to spawn eateries and video stores and garish lights. It's ironic, but perhaps fitting, that the railroad corridor at Parallels offers one of the few remaining seed pools for the landscape that once blanketed the Barrington area. That seemingly endless garden of drop seed and prairie clover and a host of other rare species has long since succumbed to asphalt and cornrows and houses and buildings. But from lingering remnants of the native landscape, the prairie, like a phoenix, will live again. Will you help it bloom and grow?
Canada goose.
It is the oaks that stand out, that beckon a traveler on Route 22 to look aside and admire their grandeur. In silent eloquence, they speak of natural heritage as yet undefeated, of a landscape that thrilled early visitors and has survived only with its original character deeply altered. It is these same oaks, scattered in a 4.5-acre grove above Flint Creek, that form the keystone of a protection and restoration project undertaken by Citizens for Conservation. Though the 33-acre site includes creek course, wetlands, and farmland, as well as the oaks, it is the descriptive word for the oak grove, Savanna, that has been adopted to name the project, the Flint Creek Savanna. The term savanna rarely, if ever, appeared in the early writings about the northern Illinois landscape. It has emerged from the prairie restoration movement of the 70s and 80s to describe grasslands with scattered trees. The terms used by early settlers for savannas included grove, timber, opening, barrens. Once a dominant feature of the northern Illinois landscape, the park-like savannas were prized by settlers for the shade, shelter, timber, and fuel supply they offered. They have been immortalized in the names of towns. Today, no tall grass savanna survives in the condition that inspired early visitors to pick up pen and paper. Listen to what Juliet Kinsey wrote on a wagon trip from Chicago to Fort Winnebago in 1831. She was describing what she called a beautiful wooded knoll that her party had chosen for a campsite. The ground around was carpeted with flowers. We could not bear to have them crushed by the felling of a tree and the pitching of our tent among them. Nothing could be more perfect than our enjoyment of this sylvan and beautiful retreat after our ride in the glowing sun. James Galloway, who surveyed the Barrington and Cuba townships in the late 1830s, was hardly rhapsodic. Upland is rolling, soil is good and fit for cultivation, timber, bur oak, and black oak, no undergrowth. But his field notes chronicled the same landscape that Mrs. Kinsey described, that is, black soil savanna. According to Elijah Haynes, who wrote historical and statistical sketches of Lake County in 1852, Cuba Township was mostly oak openings and timberland. Relics of pre-settlement savannas do persist. You can see them as you drive along roads and highways. Companies of majestic oaks still presiding over farm fields where the farmer was satisfied to let them stand and offer sheltered pasture for his cows. Or scattered among homes, obviously prized by the home builders for their shade and beauty. Or simply the beneficiaries of delayed development, untouched yet by chainsaw or bulldozer, and stretching their limbs in full oak glory. The oak grove at Flint Creek, Savanna, is such a survivor. For years, the trees formed a canopy over grazing cows from a farm on Harbor Road. School District 220 owned the property, and the oaks were secure. But in the mid-'80s, the school district decided to sell the property. By this time, members of Citizens for Conservation, Barrington's conservation group, had noted the oak grove and had walked in it. They thought back to early savanna descriptions and envisioned the restoration of native grasses and flowers to this site where they once probably flourished. They hiked the adjacent creek course, a wilderness by local standards, and began to dream of a preserve that would include wetlands, floodplain, and prairie restored to neighboring farm fields. A three-part goal became clear: to secure a sizable, diverse site that included the oak grove, to restore the various components to nature-preserved quality, to pursue the vision of a corridor that could eventually stretch from Buckley Road on the south, 7 miles northward to the Fox River. The first third of the goal has been accomplished. On the afternoon of October 9, 1988, CFC's president, Paul Hoffman, led formal dedication ceremonies of the Flint Creek Savanna under the great white oak that reputedly is the largest in Lake County. The occasion marked the culmination of 2 years of patient, complicated negotiations and CFC's first acquisition of land by purchase. John Tracy, the developer who purchased the school district property and in turn sold and donated portions to Citizens for Conservation, spoke at the dedication. Testimony to CFC's conviction that conservation and development groups can work together. The second and third parts of the goal are underway and no doubt will continue for a long time. Restoration efforts, in fact, began in the spring of 1988. With permission from District 220 and optimism over the outcome of the negotiations, teams of volunteers rescued over 2,000 native wildflowers from sites soon to be bulldozed. The developer of a site in Farm Trails North allowed plant rescuers to dig up hundreds of rue anemone, early meadow rue, prairie trillium, and wild geranium plants that grew on the property and soon would be excavated. Volunteers loaded the plants into flats, then ferried them to the Flint Creek site 3 miles away. There, Tom Vanderpool, project coordinator, designated transplant areas, and the volunteers dug the wildflowers into their new home, where they can grow in perpetuity. At the end of each transplanting session, water was hauled in large watering cans from Flint Creek to encourage the adjustment of the plants to their new location. Little did the water bearers know at the time that a prolonged drought lay ahead. Plant rescue missions will continue as long as plants associated with the restoration communities become available because of imminent destruction to their habitat. While protection of the original communities is optimum, in every instance so far, it has not been a possible alternative. The transplanting gives the plants freedom to perpetuate in appropriate, protected surroundings. Plans also call for the collection and sowing of savanna seed. The major challenge is finding seed sources for species that have largely been eliminated from the landscape. Once seed is found and collected, small propagation plots will be started to ensure an ongoing seed supply. On one seed expedition alone in the summer of 1988, over 22 ounces of seed was collected from the yellow pimpernel. On the native wildflower seed market, that amount would have cost over $1,100. Despite the drought, the rare cream gentian was another banner producer. These two species are considered typical of black soil savannas, along with others such as yellow gerardia, which blooms in September. Jacob's ladder, a spring flower whose seed capsules suddenly ripen for bursting on a June day. Wild hyacinth, which already populates the Baker's Lake savanna in Barrington. Several native trefoils, whose sticky seeds make them memorable to outdoor walkers. Great Solomon seal, which arches gracefully and suspends small yellowish blossoms in the spring and inky blue berries in the fall. Pennsylvania sedge, another Baker's Lake denizen, notable for its soft, lushly trailing aspect. And New Jersey tea, a dwarf shrubby species that explodes in sprays of white flowers in June and July. With patient reaping, sowing, and nurturing, it is hoped that all these species will flourish in the Flint Creek savanna. Other species, more often associated with prairies and woodlands, will be offered to the soil too. Because of the dynamic nature of the savanna, sometimes more open, sometimes less so, these plants most likely grew in the community. They include trout lily, bloodroot, tall bellflower, bottlebrush grass, shooting star, Barrington's official flower, and prairie trillium. Savanna, like prairie, is a fire-dependent community. Fire will be used in the restoration process, too. Once a healthy mix of flowers and grasses is established, occasional prescribed burns should provide all the management that's necessary. Although restoring the oak grove is the first priority, in time the wetlands and adjacent farmland will also be targeted for restoration. Native prairie species sown in the fields will contribute seed for another CFC restoration project at the Grigsby Prairie, 3 miles to the south. These two projects, as well as others like the Baker's Lake Savanna, should become mutually beneficial. CFC's motto is saving living space for living things. Those living things are not only botanic. Already a beaver has taken up residence in the creek. His impressive dam, built within preserve boundaries, almost suggests that he was privy to the protection agreement. On summer days, rough-winged and barn swallows swoop and dip above the creek. Red-tailed hawks regularly roost in the oaks as they survey the fields for mice. Most years, a pair nests in the oaks southwest of the preserve. Perhaps the now rare red-shouldered hawk will be attracted to the Flint Creek savanna. It favors trees near water for its nest. The red-headed woodpecker and eastern bluebird are species once common in the area and considered typical savanna birds. It's not unreasonable to expect them to seek nest cavities in the trees. With the stream so accessible to the oaks, perhaps a wood duck, certainly one of the natural world's more splendid creatures, will also find a tree cavity to its liking. There will be habitat and welcome, too, for meeker species associated with savannas. The great spangled fritillary favors milkweeds and assorted composites for nectar, while violets host the larvae. The small, harmless brown snake, with a teardrop design around its eyes, is seldom seen, but a common resident of savanna communities. Whether deer, fox, and other large mammals will call the Flint Creek savanna home will depend on the success of the third part of the goal, expansion of the preserve. The possibility of expansion both northward and southward excited CFC directors when they first proposed protection. A stream corridor stretching from Buckley Road in Barrington Hills, north past the industrial park on Route 14, along the creek that swells to impressive widths during wet seasons, through woodland, now owned by the Evangelical Association, to the Flint Creek savanna, would afford considerable mobility and protection to wildlife. From the CFC preserve, another 4 miles of creek floodplain would offer a unique, continuous link with proposed forest preserves and ultimately with the Fox River, less than a quarter-mile west of the Wagner Fen Preserve and Tower Lakes. While the protection of such a corridor presents a complicated challenge, the unique rewards it promises to wildlife, to native plant communities, and to future students of the natural world make the effort worthwhile. Those who have visited Flint Creek savanna, who have walked beneath the great oaks, who have slipped rue an enemy back into soil long ago robbed of its native plants, who have ached from cutting and hauling intrusive brush, or have paused to listen to the rattle of a kingfisher speeding above the creek, they know firsthand that this preserve deserves the financial support and the volunteer effort that it will take to restore the site to high-quality natural area conditions. Their enthusiasm is high and their energy remarkable. Won't you join them in bringing the vision of this project to fruition, in regenerating the Flint Creek savanna?
Mallard.
As we look back over the highlights of 1991, it's instructive to look back even further to the beginnings of CFC, to re-examine the purposes of the organization, to recognize its leaders, and to measure our growth. It's clear that CFC was envisioned and founded as a community organization. In 1970, Rich Anderson, the president of the Barrington Area Development Council, had appointed a Barrington Area Conservation Committee with Bill Miller as chairman to put aside land for preservation because of its natural worth and to protect the environment. Within a year, the Conservation Committee evolved into a full-fledged organization, Citizens for Conservation, with a board of directors and a slogan, Saving Living Space for Living Things. Some of those first committee members and directors were well-known conservationists and community leaders whose inspiration and leadership served the organization for many years. They included Ron Beasy, Bunny Horn, Donald Moling, Gene Ost, Alice Perkins, Dee Dee Thompson, Sodie Zimmerman, and of course, Bill Miller. The first board of directors initiated a paper recycling project, which was to be a hallmark of CFC for years. In those early days, when recycling was mostly only talked about, CFC teamed up with local Boy Scouts to collect newspaper. Later, under the able direction of Frank Spryer, a 24-hour drop-off recycling center was established, first on James Street, then across from the train station, and finally on Liberty Street. It was taken over by the village in 1988 at the encouragement of the League of Women Voters. By that time, glass and aluminum had been added to the recycling stream. 17 years of CFC involvement with recycling in the community laid the foundation for the successful weekly pickup of recyclable materials in the village today. The first board of directors also listened to an offer of land. Over the next 15 years, such offers would materialize into a portfolio of properties, including Wagner Fen, Barrington Bog, and Farm Trails North in Lake Barrington, and the Richards property in Barrington Hills. While originally the land was accepted as open space, an inventory conducted in the early 1980s made it clear that many of the sites were ecological treasures, but were rapidly deteriorating from a lack of management and pressures of nearby development. It was clear that other sites would profit from an ambitious restoration program, and it was clear that the organization would have to grow in order to meet the need for active management, community education, and more extensive preserves. Now, in 1992, we have grown to an organization of over 800 members. Our preserves total over 265 acres. Active restoration takes place on 5 of them. Our education programs reach scores of school children, scouts, garden clubs, and civic groups. Officially, we are out of the recycling business, but we continue to support that activity. Last year, CFC was selected to receive a Governor's Hometown Award. While the organization has come a long way since its modest beginning in 1971, the vision, energy, and dedication of the founders remain intact. Their emphasis on land protection and education continues, with an added focus on restoration and stewardship in order to maximize the conservation value of the preserves. The year since our last annual meeting gives ample proof of the conservation ethic established by CFC's founders and now operating year-round in the Barrington area.
Late last winter, hardy volunteers carried on weekly brush cutting outings at Wagner Fen and Flint Creek, Savanna. For 2 to 3 hours each Saturday, they cleared invasive buckthorn and other non-native vegetation. At the Fen, this clearing offers space and light and air to the native plants threatened with suffocation. At the Savanna, it makes way for the transplanting of native plants rescued from construction sites. These plant rescues continued into their 4th spring in 1991. In addition to the CFC restoration volunteers who dug and transplanted regularly 3 times a week during April and early May, 3 busloads of 5th and 6th graders from Grove Avenue School spent an afternoon rescuing native wild onions from behind Evergreen Cemetery and giving them permanent refuge at the Savanna. The Flint Creek Savanna Preserve grew last year with the purchase of 2 adjacent lots. The expansion adds continuity and buffer to the preserve, as well as offering additional opportunity for prairie restoration. In celebration of the addition, and of several years of restoration efforts, breakfast at the Savanna was held on an unseasonably chilly Saturday morning in early May. But many members and friends, including the ever-supportive Bunny Horn, ignored the weather and gathered beside Flint Creek for fellowship, refreshments, and a first-hand look at the wildflowers in the oak grove. Nesting bluebirds were present at the event, though at a respectable distance. Another activity crucial to ongoing stewardship of the preserves is prescribed burning. Early last spring, volunteer burn crews assembled at Wagner Fen to burn the same area targeted by brush cutters earlier in the year. CFC volunteers joined staff from the Cook County Forest Preserve District and Illinois Nature Preserves Commission to burn portions of Spring Lake Forest Preserve in Barrington Hills. Spring Creek Prairie, at the southern end of the same forest preserve, also was burned with the help of CFC volunteers. Each of these natural areas depends on periodic burning to suppress the invasion of non-native species and reinvigorate the native grasses and wildflowers. A prescribed burn the previous fall brought dramatic results at Baker's Lake, Savanna in the village. While that site is owned by the village of Barrington, CFC continued a management contract with the village this past year. 3 consecutive years of burning and no mowing have stimulated the remnant populations of rue anemone, prairie trillium, white-eyed grass, and wild hyacinth, among other native plants. The Savanna, along with the contiguous Baker's Lake Nature Preserve, offers a unique outdoor classroom for local groups. Last year, several college classes visited the preserve as well, with CFC volunteers as guides. Late spring brings plans for seeding, and last year was no exception. At what has become an annual seed cleaning party in the Vanderpool Rec Room, volunteers rubbed, scraped, and pounded seeds to separate them from outer coatings and ready them for sowing. Volunteers scattered appropriate seed mixtures at Grigsby Prairie and on newly prepared sections at the Flint Creek Savanna Preserve. Summer brings a welcome respite to the fast-paced restoration and stewardship schedule. It's a time to enjoy the fruition of years of ongoing labor, particularly at Grigsby Prairie. Even with last year's drought, the prairie brought visual rewards to all those who have participated in years of seed collecting and sowing. During a period that is normally a quiet one at Flint Creek Savanna, activity picked up in midsummer when a crew moved in to sculpt 2 prairie potholes in a low area. They were completed by late summer, as was a new entrance to the site, compliments of the construction engineer, John Suki. Almost immediately, migrating shorebirds expressed their approval of the shallow wetlands. July 4th brought the annual parade, and of course, CFC's nature-oriented entry. This year's vintage green truck featured a colorful selection of native wildflowers, a great blue heron, and a group of enthusiastic young naturalists. Parade judges awarded the entry 3rd prize. While restoration activity subsides during summer, it certainly does not stop. On several hot mornings and evenings, though relatively bug-free because of the drought, volunteers cut sweet clover, bull thistle, and burdock before they went to seed. Summer is also when the CFC Education Committee goes into full swing with its summer classes. On one outing, students waded through streams in McHenry County to seine for fish. Dragging seine nets between them, they identified species such as the southern red-bellied dace and the golden shiner. They caught lots of crayfish, all of which were gently returned to the stream, and at one point attracted a curious crowd of onlookers. Participants in other classes ogled frogs at Volo Bog and wove natural materials onto handmade looms. In late summer, when students returned to their classrooms, they were offered the chance to sign up for the CFC Junior Naturalist Program. Over 230 youngsters did so. They identify prairie grasses, study animal tracks, and observe winter birds as they complete activities to earn a Junior Naturalist badge and certificate. And thanks to some prairie-minded teachers, it was a group of local students who conducted the first seed picking at Grigsby Prairie. 1991 was a landmark year for the prairie in this respect. The entire 4th grade at Grove Avenue School spent an October afternoon picking seeds from monarda, coneflower, and Indian grass. CFC volunteers pick seeds too from late August to November. The drought took its toll on seed production, but regular outings took place, including the annual trip to Harvard. The restoration group was glad to have its first regular student participant from the high school, who built her horticulture project around CFC's restoration activities. Late fall usually signals more burns, but last year the skies, having withheld rain all summer, spilled lots in the fall, and the flames barely flickered. Repeated unsuccessful attempts mean that the burn crews will have an especially challenging schedule this coming spring. Winter brought an increase in indoor activities. One board member is compiling a recycling resource book, for, though recycling officially is part of our past, we still get many inquiries about the subject, and most CFC members are committed recyclers. Adventures in nature study resumed, with lots of birdhouse and bird feeder building, among other classes. CFC held its first holiday open house on the night when Santa arrived in the village and the downtown tree was lit. But work picked up outdoors, too. Armed with loppers and lots of energy, volunteers returned to the preserves to tackle invasive brush. For the first time, a regular weekday outing was added to the usual Saturday one. During Christmas break, an Eagle Scout candidate erected 15 bluebird houses he had built, several of them on the UARCO corporate campus on the west end of the village. CFC's bluebird trails, under the supervision of Brad Allen and Tom Mahorak, have made significant headway toward bringing the eastern bluebird back to the Barrington area.
The work is more diverse, the membership roll much longer and more active. We have an office, an indefatigable staff director, and many full-time volunteers. But the vision and the values of our founders continue to inspire and impel CFC today. Their dedication to conservation and nature-oriented education, their community-mindedness and spirit of volunteerism, their love of the land and its wild inhabitants point the way today and in the years ahead toward saving living space for living things. But it is clear that we cannot pursue this mission alone. If the bluebirds, the wood ducks, the black-crowned night herons, the shooting stars, the Baltimore checker spots, the golden shiners are to inhabit and grace the landscape well into the future, they will require healthy, functioning prairies, savannas, woodlands, and wetlands. As our human population continues to grow and make demands on the landscape, we must think of creative strategies to provide for wild plants and animals. Strong partnerships with government agencies are imperative. In 1991, we were pleased to work in concert with the Cook County Forest Preserve District, the Village of Barrington Hills, and the Nature Preserves Commission toward better management of the Spring Lake Nature Preserve. We celebrated the Lake County Forest Preserve District's acquisition of unprotected portions of Wagner Fen and look forward to the completion of their Flint Creek Grassy Lake Forest Preserve. We applauded the Village of Barrington's commitment to clean up Flint Creek and make it a model community-wide environmental project. We welcomed the arrival of U.S. Fish and Wildlife and look forward to cooperative projects with the local office. It is equally important that we maximize opportunities for collaboration with homeowners, institutions, developers, and corporations. Quaker Oats has been an important local supporter of the Flint Creek Savanna project. We have enjoyed working with the Sears team in their efforts to combine corporate development with natural landscaping. We applaud their recently unveiled plan for an ambitious complex of wetlands and prairie to be integrated into their new Hoffman Estates campus. We're heartened by the school district's plan to incorporate native plant landscaping into its new middle school prairie campus. The students will not only have an outdoor classroom at their back door, but they may well be able to participate in the process, and the herons of Baker's Lake will have an additional place to feed. We welcome the opportunity to continue working with the Park District, the Village, the Cook County Forest Preserve District, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife in the ongoing management of the Baker's Lake area. That preserve has the potential to demonstrate new, vigorous, productive partnerships among a variety of agencies, all of which will benefit the nesting herons, the migrating waterfowl, and the plant communities. So, looking ahead, we also look back and thank those forward-looking individuals who have steered the course to where we are today and where we can go tomorrow. saving living space for living things.